There was a call last week for a windfall tax on food companies. I've never heard anything more dangerous and stupid than that.
So there is a legendary investor named Charlie Munger. He is Warren Buffett's partner in Berkshire Hathaway, one of the best. And he has this famous saying that says, "Show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome." The reality is that taxes influence behavior. And if you don't want something, you tax it. That's
Correct.
What you do, right? Show me the incentive.
A tax on SUVs.
Right, a tax on, thin products, cigarettes,
Correct.
alcohol. We don't want them. We tax those things. And by the way, the things that we want, we get tax credits, right? All of these green initiatives.
Marriage, kids, all of it. Yeah.
So here's what you're saying. We're going to tax food. It is saying we do not want you to produce food. Who says that other than utterly nefarious and crazy people who want people to starve? It is utter insanity. There are reasons for this. There are sort of empire cycle reasons for this. And there is a jockeying of the elite to put themselves in position to rule everything.
What do you mean an empire building process? What do you mean?
End of empire. So basically, we are where the Romans were at one point in time, where the British were, where the Dutch were.
Yeah.
And there's this sort of disconnect between high debt loads and power. And when we're in a high debt load situation like the US is, and frankly, a number of other countries, the people in charge get desperate and they start doing desperate things. They never cut back on services. They never try to salvage it. They just kind of run straight into that cliff. And it's happened many, many times in history, and we're moving in that direction. The elites see this. So all these things that we're seeing is basically them trying to reshape the outcome and put themselves up on top by having you own nothing.
Hi, everyone. I'm Bruce Karasik, co-founder of the Jewish Republican Alliance. Thank you for joining us today for another special edition of JRA LoudSpeaker. We're so happy to have Carol Roth with us today. Carol is an American television personality, a best-selling author, entrepreneur, radio host, and investor. And we know you are going to enjoy our discussion with Carol. We'll be speaking with Carol in just a few minutes, but first, I've heard it said that those who rob Peter to pay Paul can always count on the support of Paul. But too many of our leaders in Congress, the Senate, and now in the White House have voted to increase taxes, implement massive government handouts. They did so at the peril of the United States. But sadly, it gave them a political edge to win re-election and attain even more power. Essentially, they're buying votes with your tax dollars. But foolish economic decisions, overspending, paying people not to work has hurt our country. And President Biden's policies of sanctions and threats have placed several foreign countries in a position where they believe it is now advantageous for their governments to move away from the dollar. And that has severely weakened the United States, in my opinion. These foolish policies reduce the wealth and prosperity of our citizens and our nation. And to make things worse, when Joe Biden was running for president, he said the following, and I quote, "I want you to look in my eyes. I guarantee you, we're going to end fossil fuel." He then proceeded to shut down the Keystone Pipeline and created an unfriendly and uncertain future for oil exploration. And this attack on the oil industry reduced incentives for investment in oil exploration, drilling, and refineries. And oil prices skyrocketed, hurting Americans while putting billions of dollars in Russia's hands with increased profits from selling their oil at the new higher prices. Russia then used these oil profits from the higher oil prices to fund the Ukrainian invasion. So then Joe Biden advocated to send billions of dollars of your tax dollars to Ukraine to fight a war that bad policies helped to finance. So there's more inflation that has been created by these policies, Higher oil prices created higher production costs, increased transportation costs on American business. And these higher costs were passed on to the consumer, all of us. The facts are indisputable. Our government spent more money and it spent it beyond its means. We were then forced to resort to borrowing and printing more money to finance our deficit. This resulted in an increase in the amount of money circulating in the economy, which led to inflation because there's too many dollars chasing fewer amounts of goods and services because the government paid people not to work. And when the government pays people not to work, it increases government handouts. It results in labor shortages. Labor shortages decrease production, but demand stayed high because they had money in their pockets. So we had supply chain disruptions, shortages, and soaring prices. And all of us know that everything we now buy has drastically gone up in price. Food, medical, gasoline, construction, interest rates, real estate, everything has gone up. There are things that we can do to take back our financial control. And we will be discussing all of this and so much more with Carol Roth after Mitch's opening remarks. I know that Carol has some important thoughts on what all of us can do to take back our financial control. Thank you all for being here. And now it is my pleasure to introduce to you, live from Franklin, Tennessee, fellow JRA co-founder, Mitch Silberman. Mitch.
Hello, JRA community. It is always so great when we are together. I launched my wealth management career, next month it'll be 30 years ago. Hard to believe. 7 years prior to that, I passed the CPA exam. So I've been in financial services for 37 years. I have seen and heard a lot, which is why I'm so excited to speak to Carol a little bit later. I'm going to share a couple of quick stories with you that are so relevant to not just what we're going on through today, but also to her forthcoming book. So in 2002, I had a liberal Santa Monica client, but then I repeat myself. And as we were discussing how to plan for and achieve financial success, she asked me, do you have access to any environmentally friendly investments? And I said, well, I do. At the time, they were called SRI, socially responsible investing. And I told her, I said, look, we can do that for you, but I have to tell you, based on my data and analysis and my research, they're subpar, they don't perform all that well, the expenses are kind of high, and there's not that long of a track record. And she said, no, that's what I want to do. And I said, okay, as we say now in the South, bless her heart, that's what we did. So fast forward a couple of years, and we're meeting regularly, and the day happened, she came to me and said, what else do you got? I said, well, I have access to all kinds of investments, but I have to tell you, they're not necessarily environmentally friendly. And she said, no, we need to make a switch. So this is a perfect example of an idea from the left that sounds good, and it really isn't. And more importantly, it devolves into something far more dangerous and nefarious. So now we're dealing with a monster called ESG. If you haven't heard of it, you'll be very familiar by the time we're done today. It stands for environmental, social, and governance. And it's a very destructive thing. I've been reading about ESG investing in investment news for years, and I always rolled my eyes until I realized how dangerous it really was and how it has an impact on our lives. See, we normal people, we love to own shares of the great companies of America and the world. We want a decent rate of return. We want a balance between risk and reward. We want to never run out of money in retirement. But our overlords, like the World Economic Forum, they can't be bothered with such trivial matters like that. No. They want to dictate to not just us, but to corporations how that money is to be deployed, right? Because what they care about is not what we care about. What they care about is protecting Mother Earth and promoting the DIE culture, what I call the DIE culture, DIE, diversity, inclusion, and equity. That's what they care about. That's not what we care about. And it's really, really bad. So when we fled California about 8 months ago, I promised my wife, Stephanie, I will find us a good Tennessee bank. So I narrowed it down to 3, and I met with each one of them individually in person. And after we exchanged niceties and they told me about their bank offerings, I said, what is your bank's position on ESG? And I am delighted to report to you that all 3 of them said, what's that? And I said, you're still on the list. And yes, we did narrow it down to one good Middle Tennessee bank, but the fact that they did not know what it was very encouraging. None other than Elon Musk has called ESG the devil incarnate, okay? Because these overlords, these arbiters, What they want is they want us to own nothing and be happy about it, which sounds like a title for a great book, doesn't it? So on that note, I am so excited to introduce Carol. I listen to Glenn Beck regularly, and when Glenn Beck has you on the show, not once, not twice, but all the time, this is someone who I just said, we've got to get Carol on the show. So let me introduce her. She's a content creator, recovering investment banker, author of The War in Small Business, which you see behind her, entrepreneur, TV pundit, and host, and from what I can tell, a mensch. She's also a New York Times bestselling author of The Entrepreneur Equation. And her next book is titled You Will Own Nothing. She has worked in a variety of capacities across industries, including currently as an outsourced COO, COO as a director on public and private company boards, and as a strategic advisor. She advocates for small business, small government, and big hair. Carol can currently be seen on a variety of networks and shows. Her multimedia commentary covers big and small business and the economy, current events, politics, and pop culture topics. She's hosted the podcast, The Roth Effect. She was formerly a radio host. She has an avid defense of capitalism and free markets. I could go on and on and on. You've seen her probably on Fox Business, CNN, HBO, Fox News, and as Larry Elder calls it, MSNBC. Ms. Roth splits her time between coasts, but maintains her primary residence in Chicago with her husband, who is also a recovering investment banker and former business partner. Carol, welcome to the Jewish Republican Alliance.
It is such a pleasure to be with you, Mitch and Bruce. I feel like I could send the two of you out on the road to help me with this book launch. You did such a great job of teeing up some of these topics. So I'm thrilled to have some surrogates so that I'm not the one that has to be doing all the talking here.
Oh, that is so great. Carol, welcome to JRA LoudSpeaker. Congratulations on your new book. It's a great title. You Will Own Nothing, Your War with a New Financial Order and How to Fight Back. What a great title. If you can take a minute or two or a few minutes, whatever time you need, to tell our audience a synopsis of your book and what you mean you will own nothing. That is a scary thought.
Yeah, it's actually kind of a terrible title, but to be fair, it's not my phrase. So the phrase "you will own nothing" that you and the audience here may or may not be familiar with is actually the #1 prediction that the World Economic Forum put out from their 8 predictions for 2030. And this came from their Global Futures Council. They put out a video, and the #1 prediction was "you will own nothing," and you'll own nothing. It was the apostrophe, you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. And when I first heard about this on Twitter, spending a lot of time on social media, you hear these things and a lot of times people just have them wrong, or there's context missing or nuance, or there's just something that isn't really the case. So I decided to do the research, and obviously the research wasn't very hard. There it was in that video. And when I started digging in, it had actually been repackaged several times. It came up in an article in 2016 from the World Economic Forum. They did another video in 2017 saying, can you rent everything that you need in your life? And so they kept kind of moving around this basic concept until they landed on it. And if you think about this, you have this group that is littered with the global elites. It's got the leading politicians and the leading business leaders and all of these very important people. And somehow they're predicting the end of private property. And as somebody who comes from, helping people create wealth, certainly Mitch been doing that, as he said, for 30 years, that was very staggering to me because, as you know, wealth derives from ownership, particularly the ownership of assets that have the opportunity to retain value or increase in value. So, that in and of itself was very concerning. And as I started exploring, a number of topics, including the ESG that Mitch talked about, central bank digital currencies, social credit, things that were going on in big tech, the millennials not being able to sort of gain wealth at the same rate as other generations. And you started, looking at this, I stumbled into this second conspiracy theory, quote unquote conspiracy theory, which is this concept of a new financial world order, which I mentioned in that opening clip that you talked about with Glenn Beck. And the idea of new financial world orders, new world orders are also not conspiratorial, and certainly not, as they relate to the current time. In fact, our current president, Joe Biden, despite what you may think about him and his competency, I don't think anyone thinks he's a conspiracy theorist. And in remarks given to the Business Roundtable in March of 2022, which is the CEOs of all the major companies of America, he said something along the lines of, there is going to be a new global economic order. It's something that happens every 3 or 4 generations. There's going to be a new world order, and we've got to lead it. The we part probably not including me or perhaps you, but somebody in his circle. And so, he was right. This is something that happens on a generational basis. It's happened many times before. We have been at the center of the global financial universe here in the United States for about 80 years. And that's challenging for our perspective, right? Because we've never lived through a period, and it's hard to imagine a world where we're not at that center of the universe. But before us, it was the British. And I'm sure at that point in time, they had some level of feeling invincible. And I'm sure the Dutch did before them. So there is this, new world order coming around, and they're openly talking about it. And as I alluded to in that opening clip, the people who are smart and well connected could see that things are shifting and go, well, we're just going to see how it plays out and hope it works out in our favor. Or they could say, well, let's do everything we can to make sure it does turn out in our favor. And that's really the underlying concept of You Will Own Nothing, is taking these conspiratorial elements out of what's happening, putting it in a historical, well-sourced context. And then most importantly, as we identify all of these issues, creating a plan to fight back, because they may want everyone here to own nothing and, their kids and their grandkids to own nothing. But and I'm going to guess the two of you, want everyone to own everything. So we've got to do the opposite of what they're talking about.
Absolutely. So Carol, if you were talking to a teenager or 20-something, and they heard what you just had to say, and they wondered, well, why should I care? Why do I care about these conspiracy theories, which are turning to be conspiracy facts? But to the young people, because we're in the know, and you're watching today, you're in the know, we're learning from you, of course, but for young people like Carol, why should I care about what you're talking about?
So one of the interesting pieces of data that I uncovered when I was doing my research is that millennials, who we all know are struggling to create and retain wealth, actually earn more on an inflation-adjusted basis. So inflation-adjusted dollars, they earn more than Gen X did or than the boomers did at the same age. So while they are earning more, they're able to gain less wealth. And that's got to be a question that everybody who is young, whether you're millennial or Gen Z, is struggling with, because I think the narrative is, oh, we're not making as much money. That's not the issue. You've identified the sort of the symptom, but you haven't identified the ailment. So don't you want to learn about this and what the causes are so that you can change it? Because you should have those same opportunities for the American dream that we all prospered from. In fact, for me, I'd share my own story. I was the first in my family to go to college. My parents my grandparents and my great-grandparents escaped religious persecution, came to the United States, and in a short number of generations, I was really able to seize that American dream. I want these young people to be able to do that as well. So that's one thing that I think is pretty interesting from a young person's perspective. The other one, which is one of my other really shocking pieces of research, is that there is $84.4 trillion that is set to turn over via inheritances. So a voluntary transfer of money in the next 23 years. And that is probably a huge opportunity for millennials and Gen Z to be able to participate in some of that legacy wealth that the family members before them have created. And so there are a lot of dynamics, and we can certainly go into it later, but that are making that be potentially at risk. And so, if you care about, hey, we want to, my parents want to give me this money, my grandparents want to give me this money, and we've been struggling out here, and we are going to continue to struggle, and that's at risk. Now maybe I have your attention.
That is such a great point. And yes, we do agree 100% with what you just said. I want to delve a little deeper into ownership. As a real estate broker for the last 25 years, I've encouraged owning real estate because it creates wealth. But owning property goes back. I did a little research. The actual Torah, where we get our Judeo-Christian values from, starts out with "you shall not steal." So if you don't steal, you have to own something, otherwise you can't steal it. There's all kinds of laws of compensation for damages if somebody damages property. There's in I think Numbers and Deuteronomy, it talks about inheritance and passing down wealth. And if a person damages your property when he borrows it, what he has to do to repay. So these Judeo-Christian values go back to our founding and what has really founded our country. And I think, the statement coming from this French philosopher that talked about how property is theft and how the left picked up on that really will undermine our wealth in our country. And I want to get your thoughts on that.
So many things. I hope I can hit them all, because you've unpacked and set up so many things. But first of all, just that ending piece. Obviously, throughout history, those people who haven't owned things have not been particularly free, and certainly haven't been particularly happy. And I don't need to share that history with everyone for them to know that it's true. I actually have a Hebrew proverb that starts out one of the chapters as we talk about real estate and ownership. And I'm going to botch it here, but it's something along the lines as, he is only a real man who owns real estate, who owns property. So yes,
I love that.
This is very entrenched and is in the book. But there's a reason why it is the symbol of the American dream. When you think about the American dream, it is very much caught up in the concept of the home, the opportunity to own your own home. And I think one of the reasons is that home ownership is the largest asset across all households in terms of determining their wealth. And one of the reasons I think that tends to be the case is because a lot of people don't understand the concept of duration when it comes to creating wealth. And, a lot of people, if you have stocks or other things, you might get emotionally caught up and make bad decisions and sell at the wrong time or whatnot. But when you buy a house, you typically have something else going on, right? It's a space that you live in. You want to be in a good area for your kids to go to school. And so these up and downs that happen in the broader market, a lot of people wait those out because they're so caught up in their everyday life. So they end up with that duration of ownership, and they are able to participate in that upside potential and that appreciation of the asset. And so I think that's part of the reason, why it's very foundational to the American dream. One of the scary things that I uncover here is that we now have Wall Street, who is competing with you for the American dream, and frankly wants you to rent you the American dream. This is something that did not happen 15 years ago. This came out of the Great Recession financial crisis and all of the Federal Reserve policy, when they decided that they were going to suppress interest rates and print money and create this easy money environment. And so it inflated all kinds of assets, and it gave people who were investors lots of money and at a very low cost to be able to invest. And they didn't know where to go with it. So they said, oh, well, this is ripe, fertile ground. Nobody institutionally has touched this before. Maybe we should start investing in single family homes. And unfortunately, we've had an undersupply of them for a whole slew of reasons coming out of the financial crisis, as well as bad laws that prevent building and add cost. And so now, as of, I think it was the fourth quarter of 2021, almost 20% of the houses that were sold in that quarter were sold to institutional investors. And they were sold to investors, not who were going to fix them up and flip them, but whose sole intent and purpose is to rent you the American dream and take the biggest source of wealth creation out of the hands of more and more Americans. Which again, it puts this idea of you will own nothing. Sounds conspiratorial, but these are real things that are happening on Wall Street, and as an outgrowth of really bad, really indulgent, really negligent fiscal and monetary policy.
Wow, that's very scary and very accurate. I've seen it myself. You mentioned something a little bit earlier, Carol, about digital currency.
Yes.
A lot of people I've heard of Bitcoin and I don't understand it. I want nothing to do with it. But when you talk about social credit, I'd love for you to address not just digital currency, whether or not you want to participate, but what it could mean to your freedom, what life would look like if this should happen.
So central bank digital currency is something that is starting to get a little bit of light, but not certainly the amount that it should. And a lot of it's coming, as you mentioned, on the back of interest in cryptocurrency. And they're very, very different. I'm not particularly somebody who is an all-in person on crypto, but I'm certainly in on the reasons why people have created these cryptocurrencies. They've created them as a decentralized platform, particularly ones like Bitcoin, to push back against fiat currency, to push back on the fact that you've had the Federal Reserve and the government, here in the United States, as well as other central banks and governments around the world, really debasing the currency, eating up your purchasing power, weaponizing the money, and people just don't want them to have that level of power and control. So they've turned to something that's decentralized, that theoretically nobody owns or can control. We can debate that, but this is the thesis of why people are in that. This is a big threat, because if you control the money, you control the people. And certainly the Federal Reserve and the government don't want to let us have this creep of cryptocurrency come in and take away their power. And so what they do want to do is leverage people's interest as well as their naivete, say, how can we use that to make something that makes us more powerful and get that put into place? So a central bank digital currency may or may not use things like blockchain. It's a digital currency. It's a digital form factor of whatever currency that Federal Reserve or that central bank and that government has created in digital format. But the key point is it's entirely centralized. The entire power remains with the Fed and the government. So instead of it being decentralized, it's centralized. So it goes against the whole sort of creation thesis, raison d'etre, if you will, of these cryptocurrencies. The scary part is what could happen with control, particularly if you get a retail-facing currency, being one that you and I use, not just one that's used within the banking system. So I want you to imagine that you have a dollar or a coin, something like that, and it has a microchip in it. And you go to your store and maybe I'm at a restaurant and I want to buy a burger because I love burgers. And so I go to pay for my burger, and they scan the microchip and they go, I'm sorry, Carol, you've had too many burgers this month. Beef is really bad for the planet. The government really doesn't want this, so we're not going to be able to accept your money. And that's the level of complete transparency, access, control that could happen with a central bank digital currency. And obviously, to connect the dots, that's something that completely takes away your agency and your freedom and is the ultimate nightmare. Now, again, we all 10 years ago might have gone, oh, the government would never do something like that. But look at the things that have happened over the last 3 years with COVID and the overstepping of our individual rights and the complete disregard for constitutional rights and so on and so forth. So I don't think it's that hard to make the leap. And there are so many sort of insidious ways that they can bring this to bear to get buy-in, because there are a couple things that do need to happen here. One is that Congress would need to authorize this. So we all need to be very aware that this is going to be slipped in a very quiet way into some bill that's, obviously talking about something else. And so we have to be on high alert and do everything we can to make sure that this doesn't come to pass from Congress. But they also have to get the buy-in from people, because they're trying this in China right now. And right now there's like over 100 million wallets that are open, but they all have like the equivalent of like 50 cents in them, because the Chinese people don't want to use them. So the people who study this in China are saying eventually the Chinese government, if they want to make this happy, is going to have to mandate this. So kind of transport that over to the United States. Well, how could they get people to buy in on this? Lots of different ways. They could say, hey, inflation is out of control. If we have this currency, we can control inflation. And you know how they control inflation is because they cut out access to your spending. So it's not like the Fed is using their tools to try to slow down the economy. They literally say, you can't spend, and those dollars won't be in the economy, and we will control inflation. That's potentially one way. Another way could be through universal basic income as a process. Oh, if you want to get free money from the government, you have to sign up and you have to use our digital currency. Or just, plain ignorance. If you go back to COVID and the stimulus checks, people are raising their hand, I want my $1,200 or my $1,000, not realizing that that was going to add $6,000 or $7,000 to their cost of living for that year and every year in the future. Well, the same thing is going to happen with digital dollars. If you turn in your one, regular Federal Reserve note, we're going to give you 4 digital dollars. You're going to be worth 4 times as much. Maybe we'll even give you $1 million. You'll be a millionaire. But we all know, for those of us who have any economic sense, that just devalues each one of those individual units of currency by the same, at least the proportional amount. You could actually say it devalues it by more. We'll get into the wonkiness of that. But think about the average person who doesn't understand this and has the opportunity to get $4 more. So there are a lot of insidious ways to get buy-in into this. And so it becomes a mechanism for control of these mandates that they want to put in place. It also becomes a mandate for controlling the way that you think and you speak. Because if you think about social credit, and this is, kind of where this all starts, social credit comes after your social standing. It comes after your job. It comes after, in many cases, your assets through cancel culture. Hey, Carol, you've got a big mouth on Twitter. We don't like that you said mean things about the Treasury Secretary, even though they're completely true. So we're just going to, not let you access your bank accounts. And again, might sound conspiratorial to people, but were people not denied the opportunity to work if they wouldn't take a vaccine? Were they not denied the opportunity to go to perhaps a restaurant or do other things like that? From our neighbors to the north, there was this freedom convoy, these truckers who saw their assets frozen because they were protesting and lost access to this. I've seen people lose access to their private payment systems because they said something bad, and that, one of a handful of payment systems doesn't want to work with them anymore. So we're not real far away from this reality today. And I think it's pretty easy to make the case that that will be the reality, because as we know, once you give the government just an inch, even if they say, oh, well, we're really not going in this direction, that's where it's going to end up. And oh, by the way, they've done a pilot program on this already through the New York Fed, and the G7 has come out with principles for retail-facing CBDC. So you don't jointly come out with these principles if it's something that you're like, oh, that's never going to happen. And so this is something that really needs to be on everybody's radar.
Carol, you have such wisdom and insight. I love your thoughts there. I would love to get your thoughts. I have a two-part question. I'd love to hear your thoughts on my opening remarks about some of the causes of inflation, overspending, paying people not to work, a war on oil, and how it relates to inflation. And then I would love to know, if Carol Roth was in charge of our economy during the pandemic, how would you have handled things differently and thereafter?
All right, so I wrote a separate book about all of this, so I have a lot of deep research. So, we didn't know exactly what was happening right at the beginning, but we had a general sense because there were some data points that came out, real quickly. I think that they could have made some provisions to keep people on payrolls for a couple of weeks and then moved directly to a mitigation stance, which obviously wasn't going to happen. But the reality of what we're facing, a lot of people are saying, oh, it was this black swan pandemic. And the pandemic itself was not in any way, shape, or form a black swan. In fact, in 2019, there was a series of exercises called Crimson Contagion that were conducted with various states that had almost the exact scenario. Hey, something escapes from a lab in China and it comes here, and what do we do? So, I mean, almost to a T, they had practiced for this. This was on the radar as something that could happen. What was the black swan event was the government's reaction to the pandemic. Yeah. So shutting down about a third of the economy, labeling some businesses essential versus non-essential, having this, unprecedented support come in for Wall Street. And I think people underestimate how important that was to changing the dynamic, because if you had not separated, mostly small businesses out, and this had affected everyone. If you had your grocery store closed, if you had Walmart closed, if Amazon's warehouse was closed and you couldn't get deliveries, if everyone had been shut down and there was no, support for Wall Street, this goes away in 2 weeks. And we moved to the mitigation stance that we ultimately got to far later. But it was clever because they said, well, no, we're going to let these big people who are politically well connected benefit, and the small guys, good luck to you. And so, not only did the big guys benefit because, any dollar that was going to be spent at a smaller player were now being allocated to these bigger players, but then we had all of this, ridiculous market support coming from the Fed that just, continued to lift the market. And even if you want to push back on me on this, even if you want to say, well, we needed to stabilize the market needed some liquidity. This is March of 2020. By the beginning of June of 2020, the NASDAQ hit an all-time high, an all-time high. So anything that was a possible emergency, support mechanism in the moment, you can't argue is emergency support when you have the markets hitting all-time highs. They should have just said, okay, the emergency support's gone, we're going to normalize there. But they couldn't let a crisis go to waste. And so both the monetary policy and the fiscal policy, as you so well identified, Bruce, really were the 1-2 punch here. I mean, you shut down the economy as if you could just power cycle a modem. You created the incentives for people to stay home. And because you added all of this easy money policy in, stocks were going up. So people were going, forget this. I'm going to be a day trader. I'm going to invest in meme stocks. I'm going to open side business, all of this just general insanity. We're now finding out that the banks themselves too saw all of this, extra money that came into the system had absolutely nothing to do with it, more than the market demand for loans. So they invested in 10-year treasuries. They did things like, say, well, we'll give you a 1% mortgage or something, and then you could take that money and go invest in the stock market. I mean, there was no market-based demand for all of this money that was being put out from a policy standpoint. And the reality is that inflation had started when the Fed began its policy during the Great Recession financial crisis, But because that inflation, we don't count asset inflation because it's a good thing for the people who own assets as inflation. Nobody seemed to care about that. That's great. My 401k is going up, my house is going up in value, everything else, which is great for you, but it's not so great for retirees and savers and people who don't own assets. It wasn't really until they messed up the supply side of the equation with some of those decisions, and then obviously with Biden coming into office and doubling down and doing his stupid energy things, but also with the stimulus, then that put direct dollars, not in investors' hands, that put it in individuals' hands. And then you had too many dollars chasing undersupply, which was obviously going to cause inflation. In fact, those dollars were called stimulus dollars. So to make the argument, oh, we didn't know that something that was called stimulus was going to stimulate the economy is just kind of like an epic self-own. So there's no way they couldn't have known this, or they're just obviously so arrogant. But they figured that they can control it. Central planners always do, and they couldn't. And that really was the foundation of what we have today. And you still have a mismatch because you don't have any help. The Fed has only so many tools, and certainly they can't do much with those tools. But the fiscal side, there's been nothing to help the supply side of the equation. There's been no changing of energy policy. There's been nothing, that's really incentivized people to go back to work or to make it easier to build homes, or any of those things that would really help. And you have, we're in a fight right now over the fact that the Democrats don't want to give up on spending while the Fed is trying to cool spending. So, we're in this complete bizarro world where everybody's rowing in the wrong direction. And unfortunately, the middle and working class Americans are the ones who are bearing the huge burden for this. And we're all paying short term, but the bigger consequences are where we're going long term. And certainly it's playing out, not just domestically, but, as you guys mentioned, with things like de-dollarization on an international stage, and moving us, more towards that new financial world order where we're no longer in the pole position of the global economy.
Boy, Carol, I just your summary of what I call, and Dennis Prager calls, the biggest mistake in human history. And you're right, it wasn't the virus, it was the lockdown. It was a horrible, horrible thing. I want to go to, and I could talk to you for hours about that, but I want to go to some of our great questions from our viewers. And there's an intriguing question that Mira Y put forth, and I'm just going to summarize it. You mentioned there's going to be tens of trillions of dollars passing, generational wealth.
Yes.
And now we have an invasion on our southern border. I don't care what anyone calls them. They're not migrants. They're not refugees. It's an invasion. They're mostly military age men. I am highly concerned. So Mira's question is, we have all this wealth coming over, and we have all these poor immigrants, illegal aliens pouring and now being spread across the country. How do those two things fare well together?
It's a very interesting question. And I think it's important as we go through this to separate the illegal invasion that we're seeing versus legal immigration, because one of the things that happened during COVID is that we saw sort of a killing of legal immigration and some of those very highly skilled people that really have hurt our workforce. And we frankly need, from a demographic standpoint, to have people who want to come to this country and participate and believe in our foundational values and have them, become part of that American dream in the form factor we understand. I think Mira's question, ties very well into exactly my thinking about what happens with this wealth transfer. Is the government, as it is trying to retain power, right, at a time where it's very desperate because it has a lot of debt, and so it doesn't have the same flexibility to do things. It can't cut back on programs because then they're not as powerful. There's only so much you can raise in taxes. There's only so much that you can do with printing because obviously that erodes the value of the dollar. So there's this really big pot of money out there that is going to pay for government expansion. I personally have tied it to a lot of the promises that have already been made, because there is, 127 or 129 trillion estimated of unfunded liabilities on top of our national debt, not accounting, what's going on at state levels or underfunded pensions or things like that. And so, I see that money at risk for these promises. And I certainly think, as you said, these bringing people into the country who are not necessarily looking to contribute, but maybe looking to be on the government dole. These are more people we can grant promises to and, basically de facto buy their votes. And there's this big chunk of money sitting there. And so the concern I have, and I think the thing that we all need to keep our eyes on, is my thesis is the way that they go after that is via things like wealth taxes and inheritance taxes. And what they're going to do, and they've already started seeding this, is they're saying we're only going after the billionaires. We want the billionaires. It's so unfair that they have so much. But as we all know, those are the people who are in the inner circles, who have great lawyers and accountants and who always find the loopholes. They're not looking at the couple of $1 trillion that's sitting in the hands of the billionaires. They want that $84.4 trillion that's going to be inherited. So if they get people to give up the principles of property rights and the fact that, oh yeah, what you own isn't really yours and we can take it, that becomes a very clever mechanism for them to quickly move from billionaires and the ultra wealthy down to you and to grab that 84.4 trillion. So I think you're thinking about that right on those terms. And this is why we have to work so hard to understand these issues. I mean, part of the reason why I wrote this book, You Own Nothing, is to empower people with the data. Because if you don't know this is something that's happening and you don't know what to watch out for, you can't even begin to come up with a plan to fight back. And so having people be aware of these things and connecting those dots is so critical, not just for the people on this call, but for us to all go out and spread this information to our friends, our allies, people in our community, because there is a ton of money at stake here. And the basic foundation of America and the American dream is at stake.
What a great answer to her question. So thorough. We have a question from Tracy K. And she wants to know what your thoughts on AI and how that will affect our economics, our economy, and our job market.
I have an entire chapter on big tech and what I consider to be the new technocracy. And it's a challenging terrain to navigate because obviously technology has done a ton to make our lives better. And I think that it has the opportunity to make our lives better. But what technology has done in the last major iterations is it's really democratized the ability for people to create wealth. What we're seeing in sort of this last iteration is the opposite. We're seeing, a couple of companies or a handful of companies in key infrastructure areas, basically like becoming de facto governments, or at a minimum becoming, little oligopolies and controlling everything. And in doing so, they're looking to rent you your life as a subscription or a service, not unlike Wall Street is looking to do with your home. And so if you think about anything that you own, you don't actually own much. Like I'll go with our little smartphones here, right? We have these bricks. But what is it that I actually own here? I paid a ton for this, but I own some, I guess, plastic and microchips and glass. But if I don't have the operating system, I can't use it. And by the way, there are two companies from a mobile operating system that cover 99+% of the entire world. So it's not like we have a lot of freedom and choice there. If my email provider decides that they don't like me, I can't get access to my email. If my payment provider decides that they don't like me, I can't. So this is only as useful as the licenses that I have come up with. And things like apps and all these opportunities to create these services that they're taking away things that you own. One of the stories I share in the book is BMW in Korea. They're creating a subscription for heated seats. So you may have the seats and you may have the heating mechanism in your car, but if you want that to actually turn on, you have to pay a fee over the life of the car. And so it's like every little thing, big tech is looking to really collect that fee and take that ownership away from you. And so I think that goes to the question of AI. And these are new territories. I think we need a digital Bill of Rights that protects a lot of the same rights that we have in the traditional Bill of Rights, but within these digital spheres. And I think that AI needs to be considered. And it's going to take some smart people to take the leadership. I think it needs to come from the private sector and not necessarily from the government, because we also don't play by ourselves here. There are actors in China and elsewhere who are working very hard to become the leaders at AI. So we can't just pretend that this is not going to exist. I think we need to be thinking about all of the risk factors and how it impacts our rights, including our individual rights and property rights, and work to come up with a framework for that, because it's not going to not happen. It's not going to go away, but it certainly is a threat. The other thing that I will add to, though, is that, AI is going to be disruptive, but there are some things that it's just not going to be able to do. And one of the things we have to remember is right now in the United States, our economy is 70% a service-based economy. And I think with the aging, the population, like I can't imagine that AI, anytime soon is going to go in and take care of an ailing parent, for example. And there are, myriad examples like that. So I think that, in terms of doing the best with it, we have to learn, like we have with other technologies, to leverage it so that it frees us up to do more things. But certainly it's going to be positioned in the opposite way, and it's going to be positioned as a way to not only take our rights and freedoms, but to create bigger government, pass UBI, do all of these kinds of things that really moves us away from that free market foundation that we know builds prosperity for everybody.
So Carol, I want to ask you about a movie we've all seen multiple times, which is The Debt Limit. So if you listen to the left, it's the end of the world as we know it. But we have different rules now. I'm hearing things from Mark Levin or other people that I've never heard, like the things that Joe Biden allegedly is willing to do. He's willing to be emperor and king and decide the debt limit and sign this and bypass Congress and da-da-da-da. So how do you think this is all going to play out?
So again, like you said, this is the bad movie that, just keeps putting out sequel after sequel and trilogies and whatnot. And I said, if I had $1 for every time I've been on TV over the years when we were about to default on our debts and, it's going to be a crisis, I'd be doing very well right now. The reality is we're not close to defaulting on our debt. We have to make some choices. Maybe some other things don't get paid, but the debt has to get paid first. And the reality is, and that you have a CPA background, but they said June 1st. What happens in the beginning of June, Mitch, in terms of revenue?
In terms of, I'm sorry?
Of revenue. What's something that happens in terms of revenue collection for the government in June?
Well, they start collecting quarterly payments.
Thank you. So they're going to get a huge influx of payments, which are due by June 15th. That are coming in over the first 2 weeks of June. So we have this June 1st date, and all of a sudden more money is coming in. So like literally there may be a couple days where they'd have to move something around or close an office. This is a lot of theater. I actually refer to Congress as a place where they perform political theater and legally launder money. So they're doing both of these in this sort of discussion. And so, we will get to some answer here. And the challenge is, I certainly think that Kevin McCarthy has the leverage right now. The challenge is, and it's a good first step, and I hate to beat down people that are taking a good first step because we haven't seen a good first step in a while, but it's nowhere near what needs to happen. The amount of spending is so out of control that it's very hard to get your head wrapped around. The idea that this is called a debt ceiling when it's been modified more than 100 times since the end of World War II, and that we've been able to rack up about $32 trillion of debt doesn't really say anything about this being an effective ceiling here. And if we were to just move back to 2019 or 2018 spending levels, like, the year before COVID, before all this emergency BS happened, we just did a reset to that, we would be running a surplus at this point in time, and we could actually be paying down debt. So the delta of like where we came from, where we are today, really shouldn't be that big. I mean, you could just completely turn this around really, really quickly if anybody had the real fortitude to do so. And I understand that the difficulties that we have given the split in Congress and given who our president is, but given the fact that back in 2011, when we lost our AAA credit rating and Joe Biden was vice president at that point in time, and at that point in time, we only had 95% public debt to GDP, and now it's at 125%. And we had less than $15 trillion in debt, and now we have 32 trillion. You'd think that maybe he'd have some like, oh yeah, I remember that whole debt downgrade thing. That was a bad thing. Maybe we don't want to be moving the country in that direction. So at some point here, we do have a window to completely transform this, but we need people to do that. And I think I never answered Bruce's question about if I was in charge of the economy or the things I would be doing. And I certainly would be getting rid of the Federal Reserve powers, and I would be dialing back the spending and across the board. I mean, there's so many things you could shut down almost entirely or leave one or two people, but like every single area has waste and the ability to make revisions, and the level that we're spending at in the aggregate, like there's no reason why you need to be spending at that level. It's just destructive. We could have a complete shift in our nation, in our fiscal foundation, the strength of our country. It would totally transform everything, but we need somebody who has that fortitude to make it happen, and also the knowledge and the understanding to make that happen.
Thank you for answering that. We have one last question. This is news that has broken over the last couple of days. And the news has come out that we've kind of known all along, that the Iranians are very close to getting a nuclear weapon. Maybe their enrichment is up to 80-something%. And now they are building a nuclear facility that's over 100 yards deep, that maybe weapons can't knock it out. Israeli defense leaders are saying it may be time for a strike. If that happens, how will that affect the world, our security, and our economy? Iran is right next to Russia. It could be a problem.
So saying this from a financial context, because I am certainly not a geopolitical expert, and I don't even play one on TV. I play a lot of things on TV, but that's geopolitics isn't one of them. One thing I can tell you in studying these historical cycles that we go through, and you will own nothing, is that not every war brings about a new financial world order, but every new financial world order has been preceded by war. And so I think whether it's what's happening between Iran and Israel, or anywhere else, frankly, and unfortunately, Israel, or China and Taiwan, or some of these other areas that are very precarious, and places where groups around the world are looking at the United States and seeing our weakness. They're seeing the weakness in our president. They're seeing our financial state in weakness. They're seeing, frankly, the weakness in our allies. Our G7 allies are a mess. And I've been calling them paper tigers. They're kind of like the quarterback who's aging, who's, playing on their old glory years, and certainly not Tom Brady, but some of the other aging quarterbacks. That's what's happening with our allyship. So there is a tremendous weakness. And, those are the kinds of things that can be a catalyst. Those may not be, but certainly we would require a catalyst in order for the U.S. to be willing to create some sort of a reset financially. And so I think that we want to look to those issues, obviously, not only from their huge potential for the destruction and loss of life, which is obviously first and foremost, but also the implications and what that means financially as well.
Carol Roth's new book, You Will Own Nothing: Your War with a New Financial World Order and How to Fight Back. We've posted a link on our chat. Carol, where can they get your book?
So the book is available wherever fine books are sold. It's on pre-order now, but if you get it, you'll get it in your hot little hands on the release date, July 18th. A lot of people like to buy from Amazon. It's great for rankings. If you want to support a small business, you could buy it from your local bookstore, bookshop.org, or wherever you want. But the other incentive, if you buy a hard copy, because I'm trying to get people to own things, so I want you to actually physically own a copy. And if you do that and you go to carolroth.com/pre-order, another reason to pre-order right away, you can get either an autograph plate for your book and or some physical metal by a group that I work with called Goldline. So some incentives to, not wait to put that off, to do that right away so that you can take advantage of those pre-order bonuses. carolroth.com/pre-order after you buy your hard copy, because you have to upload the receipt to be able to do that.
Thank you so much for joining us. It was such an informative, a quick hour and enjoyable conversation.
Yeah, no, you guys were great. Thank you so much for having me. I can't believe that we burned through the time so quickly, but I hope that the audience feels a little bit more informed and will empower themselves with even more knowledge and fight back, because it's really going to take all of us, individually standing up and doing these things to do, listen to not what they see, look at what they're doing, and making sure that we're taking care of ourselves.
You certainly did. Some of the things that we say to our audience all the time is stay informed, get involved, and make a difference. And you certainly informed our audience today. So thank you very much. And until we meet again, everybody, we wish you well. We're going to be planning some live events as well. So look forward to some further announcements on that. And we will talk to you very soon. Thank you, Carol, again.
Thank you.